So our speaker for tonight is Dr. Adam Dodd. And I met Adam some years ago when he was showing the documentary of Westall 66 and having at the University of Queensland and having a discussion about that. Adam received his PhD in Media and Culture in 2009, and he currently teaches Media Studies and Communication at the School of Communication and Arts at UQ. He's published widely on the cultural history of insect-human relations, and he's especially interested in how representations of insects have historically shaped representations of extraterrestrial beings. And Adam's been fascinated by all aspects of the UFO phenomenon since childhood, and wrote his honours dissertation on alien abduction and narratives in 1998, which was followed by numerous media appearances, including interviews on Today Tonight and Radio National. So, Adam, welcome to the meeting, and I'm going to hand it over to you. And yes, looking forward to your presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Cheryl, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Just going to share my screen here. Okay, so I thought the format for the talk will be similar to how I'm used to presenting. So I don't have a pre-prepared speech, so I won't be reading anything. I'm just going to take us through this PowerPoint presentation that I've put together, and I'll be using the slides as kind of jumping off points. I haven't really rehearsed this talk yet. I was sort of finishing off this afternoon, so I think it should come in at around an hour. So it's a version of a talk I'm also giving tomorrow morning at the Cleveland Public Library, and they've asked me to talk for 45 minutes or 50 minutes there. So that's the kind of time frame I'm thinking. So, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions and discussion if folks want to do that at the end. So this is the title of my talk, Thinking with UFOs, and I've added a subtitle there just to clarify where we're going a little bit further. So non-human intelligence communication. This is new research, so I haven't presented this anywhere before. So you folks are kind of the guinea pigs, I guess. But it's part of work I've been doing from this particular angle for about 6 or 12 months. It's building towards a publication, so I'm collaborating with some scholars in the US, and we're sort of shopping around a collection of essays to academic publishers for a collection of essays on academic perspectives on UFO phenomena. I'm quite optimistic that we'll find a publisher for that. And then the longer sort of objective for me is to get a book proposal together for a more general audience. So something that kind of draws from my academic training in media and communication and applies that to the UFO problem. So that's sort of what I'm doing here in a nutshell. And I am going to be talking about artificial intelligence a bit tonight as well, and the ways that I think that might be relevant to what's happening with UFO phenomena, particularly in the last 10 years or so. And just as a full disclaimer, while we're talking about AI, I would just point out that the image you're looking at was not created by a human. It was created by non-human intelligence. It's an AI-generated image that I created. I didn't really create it, but I entered the prompt thinking with UFOs, and that's the image that the AI gave me. And I've got a couple more AI-generated images included in the talk tonight as well. And just you can see that's my university email address at the bottom. Don't worry if you don't take that down now, but if you do have any questions after the talk or something occurs to you later on in the week or whenever, please feel free to reach out to me at that email address. Okay, so I'm assuming that folks don't really know anything about me or my sort of research background or where I'm coming from. Cheryl mentioned briefly my work on insect-human relations. That was a big part of my graduate work. So my PhD work and then my postdoctoral work in Norway at the University of Oslo was much more conventional than what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So it didn't involve UFOs, but it did involve this issue of how we as humans manage our relationships and also our lack thereof with non-human others. So just briefly, the insect-human stuff was part of a larger discipline called human-animal studies. Primarily, that's a field within the humanities. It's very multidisciplinary. So we have people from literature, sociology, anthropology, history, cultural history, media studies as well. And the shared interest there is learning more about the kinds of relationships that humans have formed with other animals, how those relationships change over time, and how they're formed in the first place and how they're maintained. My interest in insects actually came out of my deeper interest in UFOs and the idea of alien life, because it began to occur to me that a lot of the ways in which aliens, I don't really like that word, but aliens are portrayed have a lot in common with insects. And if you actually look at the emergence of science fiction as a genre in the late 19th century and early 20th century, that's the same time that the microscope and the telescope were becoming quite popular. And what that means is, particularly with the microscope, a lot of humans were having close encounters with very, very strange life forms that people just hadn't seen before. So a lot of very exotic submarine organisms and also microscopic organisms. And so this kind of cliche of the big eyes with the antenna that really characterized a lot of portrayals of so-called aliens in the 20th century, I think has something to do with the general collective experience of encountering very strange earthly creatures during that period. And of course, there's an ecological angle to insect-human relations as well. I won't go off on too much of a tangent there, but I'm sure I don't need to explain to you folks that we are in a pretty serious ecological crisis at the moment globally, and part of the reason for that, I'd suggest, is we've made the planet too human. I don't know if folks are aware, but currently 96% of all mammalian biomass on the planet, 96%, is humans and our livestock. And the remaining 4% of mammalian biomass is 2% terrestrial mammals and 2% marine mammals. And so the issue of species conservation is part of this story, and I've always found it frustrating that insect conservation efforts really tend to get marginalised because the insects aren't very cute and cuddly. It's hard to get people to donate money to save bugs, even if you explain to them that the bugs are essential for the environment, for the ecosystem on which we all rely. I think bees have kind of changed that a little bit, but of course insects are a much broader category of animals than just the bees. So I guess I see what I've already done in that conventional space of insect-human relations and animal studies as actually sort of giving me a way into thinking a little bit more progressively about how those ideas that circulate in that discipline might help us think about non-human intelligence in more exotic ways. So let me just continue here. So the title of the talk is Thinking with UFOs, and I just want to say a few words about what that means and how I see it as being a little bit different from thinking about. So, and again, this is not my original concept. This is well ingrained in the field of human animal studies, where we often would talk of thinking with animals rather than thinking about animals. And the reason we do that is, as you can see there, thinking about implies a kind of contemplation from a distance. involving a kind of unbridgeable separation. A big part of human-animal studies has been about addressing what's called anthropocentrism, the kind of privileging of the human, of Homo sapiens, as being this sort of top of the hierarchy, top of the pyramid, at the center of everything. And even the term non-human animals is a little bit anthropocentric, in the sense that we don't really speak of, non-giraffe animals or non-dolphin animals. The idea is, well, there's humans and then there's all the other animals. The idea of thinking with animals, I'll get to that in a moment actually. One more thing I just want to say about thinking about. The reason why thinking about became the kind of dominant way of thinking within much of the Western academy, particularly in the modern era, is because of this idea of objectivity, which became the kind of baseline way of thinking, the baseline aspiration for making knowledge in the Western sort of tradition, in Western universities. So the idea is, well, in order to learn about a thing, I have to have some kind of distance from it. There has to be what's often called a critical distance, because if you're too close to the thing that you're studying, the idea is you're losing your impartiality. It compromises your critical thinking, because now you're sort of part of the thing that you're trying to describe. Now, there are good reasons for that idea sort of forming. It has a certain amount of utility. I personally happen to think it's a kind of delusion. I don't want to get too spiritual here, but I believe ultimately we are all part of a kind of whole, and that separation, even separation that we experience, is a kind of illusion. It's illusory. A deeper truth is that everything is connected, and I think there's something about UFO phenomena that might be trying to remind us of that, sort of close down the ways in which we separate ourselves from other things. So that's the idea of thinking about. It takes us only so far, and then it's got limitations, and so I'm trying to kind of get beyond those limitations. So thinking with, which is what I'm trying to do in this talk, is about acknowledging that our thoughts and our feelings and representations and our behaviours, I'm going to try not to use too much jargon, but co-constitutive, meaning formed together with non-human others. So as I mentioned, this idea is well ingrained in human animal studies. That's where I kind of picked it up and took it on board. The idea is that beliefs about what human beings are, and in fact definitions of the human, have always been formed in cooperation with other animals. This is the paradigm of human animal studies, and so we become human because of our relationships with other animals, not despite of those relationships. And we might even venture a little bit further and suggest that there's a moral component to that as well. I'm going to talk about dogs in a minute before we get into UFOs specifically. But, I'm not the only one who believes that dogs make us better humans. It's not just that the humans are in our own little bubble and then there's everything else around us. We couldn't have become these things called humans as a concept were it not for our ability to compare and contrast ourselves with other animals. And so my claim, trying to sort of tie this stuff into the UFO, and again, this is not my original idea. This is something I've drawn from Jacques Vallée's work, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. My claim here is that our cultural responses to UFO phenomena, so by cultural responses, I mean our shared beliefs, values, and practices that have to do with UFOs, including popular culture, including scientific attempts to understand UFO phenomena, all of it, are formed cooperatively with the phenomena itself. That's my claim. That's what I mean by thinking with. An implication of what I'm saying there is that we meaning humans, are not entirely in control of our own culture or society. that might be pretty unsettling for some folks. I believe it's the intellectually honest position to take. It would be nice to think if humans are steering the ship of our own society. I don't actually think that's entirely true. I think our society is being directed and shaped by not just humans, but more than human phenomena, including UFO phenomena. That might be a controversial claim to make if you want to bring UFOs and non-human intelligence from other planets, I guess, into it. But again, just to sort of lean in on more conventional academic ideas for a moment, media studies, a lot of media studies now is very focused on digital media, almost entirely, in fact. And if you're studying digital media in the academy in 2024, it's very hard to avoid the issue of algorithms, predictive algorithms, and the extent to which algorithms are shaping our media diets. So algorithms are often incorporating artificial intelligence into their systems to make predictions about content that it thinks we will enjoy. And of course, algorithms and the artificial intelligence that run them are forms of non-human intelligence. I'll come back to that in a little bit, but I just sort of wanted to plant that there just as a reminder that this is already happening. I'm making a little bit more of a bold claim here by suggesting that maybe we would want to incorporate the non-human intelligence that's behind UFO phenomena into this, but we don't even have to go that far to already see that it's happening. Of course, the media that we consume have a big part to play in our beliefs and our values and our practices, our beliefs about the world and so on. And the last time I checked, it was about 70% of all YouTube videos that are watched are videos that the algorithm has suggested to the viewer, rather than videos that the viewer has intentionally sought out or searched for. And it's probably higher than 70% now. I haven't checked in a while. The point is, the majority of stuff that people watch on YouTube was not sought by them. It was presented to them by non-human intelligence. And of course, we know that not just YouTube, but YouTube has had a big impact on what people believe about the world and how they behave and so on. Okay, and just briefly, I feel kind of obliged to just say a few words about my position on UFOs specifically. I'm going to use the term UFOs rather than UAP. I think UAP is actually better and more inclusive for a bunch of reasons, but I'm just kind of too used to saying UFOs. So I'll just stick with UFOs for the time being. So this is my position, that about 95% of reports, I didn't pluck this statistic out of thin air, this is a pretty consistent one across most large UFO report data sets, going right back to the Blue Book data, about 95% result from misidentifications of atmospheric and celestial phenomena, balloons, drones, experimental aircraft with which the observer is unfamiliar. I'm not really interested in hoaxes. I mean, I think hoaxes constitute such a small percentage that it's not really statistically significant. Like, yes, some people will attempt hoaxes, but yeah, I don't think hoaxes are that significant statistically. But this residual 5%, so what do we do with those? My sense is that some UFOs, and by some I mean part of that 5%, the outliers, constitute evidence. I'm not going to say proof, but certainly I think constitute evidence of non-human intelligence. And that's why I think that what we might call the non-human intelligence hypothesis is worthy of consideration. It doesn't mean that I believe we're being visited by aliens from other planets, but I believe that that many of the events, the cases that are part of that 5%, really look like something non-human is going on, and something that's also intelligent. I still from time to time end up in stupid arguments with so-called skeptics on the internet about this. It happened again recently. Despite my better judgment, I was sort of drawn in by a troll. I was trying to explain to this person what I meant by non-human intelligence, why I thought that was something that would include more than just aliens that evolved on another planet and traveled to Earth in space vehicles. But this person was so locked in to that definition, aliens, I started to wonder, am I really conversing with a human at this point, or is this like a bot? Because it started to not really feel like a genuinely human exchange. That word aliens, one of the things I got out of that unpleasant exchange was that the word aliens has almost replaced little green men. That no one really talks about little green men anymore. Thankfully, it's kind of faded away, but it was the kind of go-to term for ridicule for most of the 20th century. But I think the word aliens now has taken over the function of little green men. And I don't think anyone who's seriously considering the NHI hypothesis for UFOs really uses the word aliens. And I'm not going to use the word aliens very much tonight, not in terms of the hypothesis. So as I've already indicated, artificial intelligence that runs a lot of media systems is non-human intelligence. So non-human animals are also forms of non-human intelligence. So there's not really any debate to be had about whether NHI exists. I think the debate that's there is like, how far does it go? How big is the category? What forms of NHI are around us? And could there be forms of NHI with which we're not familiar yet? And spoiler alert, I think the answer is yes to that question. Our models of reality are not yet complete. So my interest is in that anomalous 5%. I'm not interested in the misidentifications. I mean, there's an interesting psychology to that, but it's not as interesting as the anomalous 5%. And so there I'm talking about airborne and sometimes submarine objects. I know Richard Dolan's got a book coming out soon about what's the term? USO, unidentified submarine objects, or USP. The point is that the submarine ones have been kind of largely neglected in favour of the airborne ones, but we're already seeing evidence of transmedium UAP happening as well. So these are objects that exhibit intelligent control, meaning they perform evasive maneuvers, they move against the wind, or they remain stationary in the wind, which balloons don't do, which aircraft, objects that aren't intelligently controlled don't do. No visible means of propulsion, operating in ways that can't be explained by our current understanding of physics, and which can't be attributed to any country of origin. Now, just before I continue on those last 2 points, objects that operate in ways that can't be explained by our current understanding of physics and which can't be attributed to any country of origin. I'm starting to see a lot of official, by official I mean government and military, explanations of UFO phenomena and events as drones. If any of you are following Ross Coulthardt's work on this, he's been speaking about this a bit recently as well. Drones, we have to be careful of the way that word is used as an explanation for UFO events, because it's starting to overinflate itself and in the same way that balloons and weather balloons used to in the 20th century. I'm sure that some UFO reports are reports of drones that the observer isn't familiar with. I've mistaken a nighttime drone for something more exotic myself. It's easy to do, particularly if it's in the distance and you can't hear it, and it's a strange coloured light and it's moving around. But even something moving around that way, that can be explained by physics. So the really exotic ones, that hit Mach 5 without issuing a sonic boom and things like this, no visible means of propulsion, something non-human, I think, is likely to be behind those sorts of events. And just lastly, I don't want to go on about this too long. We've got other things to talk about. But again, I'm seeing this in a lot of so-called skeptical opposition to the NHI hypothesis. As you all probably know, people can react quite emotionally to even the suggestion that the NHI hypothesis should be considered. Like even just to go that little far, I'm just thinking about it as a potential hypothesis for some events. You'll often just get absolutely slammed, like it's heresy or something. And one of the reasons that I've noticed that people will sort of come down on you like a ton of bricks for even suggesting it is this idea that, well, no, the weird ones that you're talking about are just secret man-made experimental aerospace tech, the black budget stuff that no one knows about. Because there's all these billions of dollars that go into black budget aerospace tech, and you don't know what they've become capable of. And so that's a simpler explanation than NHI. This idea of Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is likely to be true. The problem I have with that proposition that, there are no NHI behind UFOs, that it's much more likely to all be exotic, earthly, secret, advanced aerospace tech, is we're talking about objects that are often brightly illuminated. The lights have become like a running theme in UFOs, and lights are like this. And of course, they also often appear in broad daylight. And so they've frequently made themselves visible for 80 years. And that's a very conservative time frame. It's older than 80 years, but for argument's sake, let's just say it began during the Second World War. So it's not logical. Making something visible and hence potentially knowable is incompatible with the concept of secrecy. So you don't get to have it both ways, in my mind. You don't get to claim these are secret tech, but also they're being flown around where they can be seen by military aviators and the general public, captured on radar and infrared and learned about. That none of that is compatible with a top secret, highly classified project. And also, there's no evidence that this advanced tech that went off on some tangent while trillions continue to be poured into inferior tech like stealth bombers came out of nowhere 80 years ago and has never been used for anything other than sort of interfering with military training exercises and sparking new religious movements and popular culture amongst the general population. So, I mean, the only way I think that the really weird ones could possibly be explained as earthly as if they're part of this ongoing psychological program. And I just think that's a bit of a stretch. And the last thing I just want to say on that too is if you happen to be so wedded to Occam's razor that the simplest explanation is always likely to be true, and you've decided that an earthly explanation is always more likely to be true than an extraterrestrial one, it kind of means that you will never be capable of recognizing anything extraterrestrial or intelligent if it did appear. So, for example, if you've gone all the way down that road, and let's say, for argument's sake, a huge silver disc appeared in broad daylight in front of the White House, filmed by all the syndicated media, broadcast live around the world, and everyone's got it on their smartphones, and it descends, and then some little grey beings with big black eyes step out onto the lawn, and everyone's seeing this happen. Your explanation would be, well, this is a psychological operation. They've got a black budget, maybe they created some genetically engineered organisms to look like aliens, and this is all a hologram and whatever. You're kind of locked into an anthropogenic framework from which you can never escape because you've decided that the extraterrestrial or the exotic is always less likely than something human. And I think that's a cognitive cage in a lot of ways. But it's secure. I think I understand why people like to stay in that cage because it gives you a feeling of being tethered to something in which humans are still kind of in control. Okay. Just very briefly, again, assuming no one really knows much about my background, so that's the book I wrote about insects, came out a few years ago. It's a cultural history of the beetle. a lot in there about the relationships that beetles and humans have had through history, the role that beetles have played in religion and folklore, popular culture and science and so on. So very much about, the non-human. The other three in the centre, there are some pieces I've written for the conversation over the last 4 years or so. The one in the top centre is the most widely read one. It's actually the most widely read thing I've written so far. That one actually went a bit viral when it came out. 750,000 views, I think, the last time I looked. So, I mean, that sent a clear message to me that a lot of people are interested in the question of UFOs and what would count as a legitimate representation. The other ones have been quite widely read as well. And then over on the right, that's a scholarly paper that I published in 2018. It's scholarly, published in a scholarly journal. There's a lot of jargon in there. The talk I gave at the UFO Research Queensland meeting in 2020, a lot of it is pulled from that article. So in a nutshell, it's about how high-profile scientists like Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan, and others, how do they talk about UFOs in public settings? Why do they talk about UFOs in that way? And it's me trying to theorise why do they all try to discourage public interest in UFOs? And I closely scrutinised the way that they use language to kind of close down public interest in UFOs. And I draw on some well-established sociological theories to help explain why that's a thing that happens. One of the most personally gratifying things for me in this space over the last few years has seen Neil deGrasse Tyson's public persona around UFOs start to kind of melt away. I was frustrated for many years by Neil as the kind of go-to scientist to weigh in on UFO phenomena, and he never did a good job. And he did a very good job of introducing ridicule, but he never really helped, in my mind, helped anyone in the public to think clearly about the topic. He would often say, remember what the U stands for, unidentified. I'd be like, thank you, Neil, no one's actually getting that. And then he would say, bring me evidence. If you get abducted by aliens, bring me an ashtray, something we can study in a lab. And again, it's not the public's job to provide evidence to the scientist. The scientist is supposed to act on their curiosity and obtain the evidence themselves. That's kind of how science tends to work. So my long list of complaints about Neil deGrasse Tyson is misleading the public about how science works. Anyway, I explain more about why he behaves that way in public settings in that paper. And then finally, I've been, as Cheryl mentioned, my honours dissertation back in 1998. This was kind of my first experience of being represented in UFO media. I kind of got sort of pulled into it. And predictably, the attachment to the X-Files was made very explicitly there. I ended up sort of calling this phenomenon X-filing. There seems to be a pattern in particularly journalism, like news media. When news media chooses to do something on UFOs, it's almost like they're required to mention the X-Files in some way. They'll either say the truth is out there, or play the X-Files theme, or make some gesture towards the X-Files. I guess because it's a familiar cultural touching point, but I think it also, I'll talk more about this towards the end. The X-Files, a little bit like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and The Twilight Zone before that, all seem to address this idea of something in between, in between everyday reality and the bigger thing that we're all in that we don't understand. And so I think, the X being a symbol of the unknown, I think it's symbolic, but it's also kind of frustrating that became this kind of almost cliche. because, the X-Files, a lot of people take it seriously as being a program that helped move some real ideas of value and even some real sort of concepts into the public realm, but in the form of a fictional program. So it can kind of be it can be dismissed just as easily as it can be sort of taken seriously. So it's a double-edged kind of sword. Excuse me, as I mentioned, I'll come back to that concept of media that's kind of in between and the UFO a little bit later. Okay, now we are going to get into UFOs, but I just want to stay with animals briefly before we get there, because this is essentially what I'm trying to do in this talk is carve out a way of thinking based on established ways of thinking, but moving it forward to, I hope, in a way that can help us think a little bit more constructively and productively about UFOs. So this film, Microcosmos, it's a French nature documentary from 1996. I was obsessed with, I still kind of am, but I was obsessed with this film when I was doing my PhD dissertation, because it's just one of the most amazing portrayals of insect life I think ever produced. One of the things that distinguishes it from an ordinary wildlife documentary is the complete absence of a human narrator. So, the familiar David Attenborough format, we see lots of amazing images of animals, and there's always a human talking over the top. The human talking over the top kind of guides our perception of what we're seeing. And that has some value, like wildlife documentaries have that educational agenda. But one of the things that really strikes you when you watch Microcosmos and you realize no one's talking is you are now just fully immersed in what you're looking at. And it in a way, it amplifies the strangeness of the insects, because the micro cinematography is very, very sophisticated. At the time, it was some of the most close-up moving pictures of insects that had been achieved, and you're just kind of in the world, hence the name of the film, Microcosmos. You're in the world of the insect. The subtitle in French there translates to the people of the grass. That struck me when I was doing my grad work as well, because my interest was on anthropomorphic portrayals of insects, meaning the ways in which insects are portrayed as having human qualities. And that word people tends to be used exclusively for human beings. But if you scrutinize what counts as a person, there's actually a kind of spectrum. So, I think dogs are people. There's even a great song by the Australian indie band The Foes, Dogs Are the Best People. It's a bit old now, but no, I believe that. And, dogs are people in the sense that they have personalities. I don't think anyone would really argue with that. They have names. We give them names. They're protected by certain laws in society. They have rights and privileges. They're people. But how far through the animal kingdom do we want to extend the category of people? In the film, that it's a provocative title. They suggest insects are like people as well. So there's that. But also just looking at the image that they've used there for the film, it's very alien-like. I watched the film adaptation of Communion. I'm going to mention Whitley Strieber's Communion a little bit later, but the film, I've seen it many, many times, but it had been a few years since I'd watched it, starring Christopher Walken, and I'd forgotten the scene in the bus. I think he's coming out of a pretty traumatic hypnotic regression session, and he's catching the bus home in New York City, I think it's New York, and he kind of has a kind of hallucination. It's not really clear what he's experiencing, but everyone on the bus looks like a praying mantis. They've all got the praying mantis heads, and he starts to kind of freak out. And if you look at that image of the praying mantis used for Microcosmos, it's very evocative of the alien, of the extraterrestrial alien, set against, we assume it's the moon, but it could be a kind of, a glowing white orb, really common UFO phenomenon as well. And so there are these illusions, this collapsing of the categories of the insect and the alien, the non-human intelligence. And this quote here I just love. This is from the companion volume. So the directors of the film wrote a book as well. There's a lot of amazing photographs in the book. And this is how they're kind of setting it up. This is how they're framing the world that they want to take the reader and the viewer into. And this quote, it might as well be about aliens or non-human intelligence or even fairies, rather than just animals. Animals live in worlds parallel to our own. We can occasionally reach them through fragile passageways. The world of insects is one of the most remote of these non-human worlds. It lies somewhere on the edge of our perception. The path leading to it is strewn with paradoxes and oddities. This all sounds very familiar to UFO aficionados. We must keep our imaginations alert as we enter this world and be prepared to set aside our most firmly held beliefs. I hope you can see what I'm sort of getting at there, that there's a sense in which that kind of language is very compatible with the kind of language that's had been previously used in a lot of literature on fairies in the 19th century, and then more recently, the kind of language use that we see in a lot of writing about UFOs and non-human intelligence. So I guess what I'm getting at there is our relationships with insects have already count as work towards this higher goal or more challenging goal of incorporating other forms of non-human intelligence into our world, into our framework. And doing that does require us to set aside some of our firmly held beliefs, because some of those firmly held beliefs, again, sort of limit us and create a kind of cage. Okay, this fellow, William James, some of you may be familiar with him. He's essentially the founder of psychology in America, or American psychology as a discipline. He was the first person to teach a psychology course in a university in the US. He wrote a book in 1909 called A Pluralistic Universe. Highly recommend having a look at it if you're interested. You can easily find PDFs of this book online. He's widely regarded as one of the most important figures in psychology. But I was reading Jeffrey Kripal. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Jeffrey Kripal. He's a professor of comparative religion at Rice University in Texas. And I'm reading a book of his at the moment called The Superhumanities. And it's all about how the super, meaning the more than human, including non-human intelligence, but also deities and so on, have kind of been excluded from the humanities, even though many of the founding figures of the humanities, going all the way back to Plato, were quite explicit about the reality of non-human beings and entities. And James was very, very invested in paranormal phenomena and spiritualism. And I just love this quote from James. I sort of got to this through Kripal. What does he say? The drift of all the evidence we have seems to me to sweep us very strongly towards the belief in some form of superhuman life with which we may, unknown to ourselves, be co-conscious. We may be in the universe as dogs and cats are in our libraries, seeing the books and hearing the conversation, but having no inkling of the meaning of it all. I think we are in the universe as dogs and cats are in our libraries, and that UFOs represent something that we probably will never be able to fully understand or know, because we are limited, because we're a particular species in the same way that dogs and cats are. We're finite in our ability to comprehend the world around us. We don't have the ability to know everything in truth. We can expand our minds and grow our knowledge, but not infinitely. That's what I think. And so if you imagine a dog or a cat in a library, so a library is something created for humans by humans. There's a place designed to be meaningful to humans alone. But if a dog walks into a library, a dog can see the books and can hear the people talking, so it knows that those things exist. But it's very limited. The dog is very limited in being able to understand the meaning. Okay, so what I'm getting at there, I'm trying to draw a connection between what James is saying there and our relationship with UFO phenomena. So we can know that they exist, but we might be limited in knowing what they mean. But I think we should try to learn what they mean because I suspect that the intelligence behind them is trying to teach us something. I'll come back to that proposition a little bit later. I'm just going to stay with dogs again, just very briefly. Don't worry, I'm going to get straight into UFOs eventually. This is a really famous painting by Francis Barraud called His Master's Voice. And I've chosen it there because, again, the dog, so the gramophone was still a pretty novel technology at this time. It was, I think, less than 20 years old. So the experience of hearing a recorded voice was a novel one for many humans still at this time, and certainly a novel experience for a dog. And so the artist here is trying to capture a moment, or is capturing a moment, where a dog is hearing his master's disembodied voice. So the point here is the dog can absolutely hear his master's voice and recognize it as the voice of his master, but is not able to understand what is actually occurring. It doesn't understand the technology that it is experiencing. And I think one of the reasons why this image has persisted, as a continuously meaningful image, is it tells us something about ourselves. Certainly tells us something about our own relationship with new media, but I think we could push it a little bit further into this. It might tell us something about our experience of media and technology that wasn't made by humans and which isn't under human control. So that kind of quizzical look, I think it's there's some symbolism in there that we can draw from. And then finally, just on dogs, staying with the theme, I used ChatGPT to ask, do dogs watch television? And the non-human intelligence behind ChatGPT said yes, they can. I won't read through the whole paragraph there, but if any of you have dogs and you've got like a newer television with a high refresh rate, excuse me, you probably noticed dogs will watch it. Now, I haven't gone right into the research. It's tricky research to do, as you could imagine, whether if you're showing 4K motion pictures of dogs on a television, is your dog seeing dogs on the screen, or are they just seeing interesting colours and shapes? I kind of think that they can interpret the images. I think that high resolution and the high refresh rate has enabled a lot of dogs to have a meaningful visual experience with televisions in ways that they couldn't before, because the old cathode ray TVs, to a dog, we know enough about canine vision to know what that would generally look like to a dog, and it wouldn't be meaningful imagery. It's a lot of flickering. So no one was really noticing their dogs watching old TVs, but now it's become pretty common. So again, in the same way that in the 19th century, dogs could listen to recordings, dogs can watch motion pictures, but they will never fully understand, I think, what it is they're engaged with. In fact, if I'm being honest, most humans don't understand how TVs work either. We just know that they do work. We just have faith that this is not magic, this is just science that's making this possible. Okay, so we can learn from animals, we can learn from non-human others about ourselves, and they can help us broaden our thinking beyond the human. I've got a few more quotes on the way into the UFO stuff. I promise I am getting there. Mary Douglas was a very influential British anthropologist. I love this quote because it draws attention to how anomalies are actually produced. So I think we can all agree that UFOs are anomalous phenomena, meaning they are objects and events that don't fit within our framework, our model of reality. What Mary Douglas is saying here is any model, any system of classification gives rise to anomalies. The anomalies, the anomalousness, if that's a word, is not a property of the UFO. The anomalousness is an artifact of our system of classification. So if our system of classification cannot accommodate something, because no system can accommodate everything, then the UFO appears as anomalous. So we've got a choice to make it at that point. Do we want to rework and expand or reconfigure our system of classification to include the anomalies like UFOs, or do we just want to persist and try to ignore those anomalies, even though they keep bothering us and getting in the way and reminding us that our system is incomplete and requires some reworking? And this quote here, that any given culture must confront events which seem to defy its assumptions, I think is just kind of eternally true. And UFOs, I think, illustrate that with a particular clarity. UFOs are events which defy our shared assumptions in many ways. Certainly our assumptions about what's physically possible. Just building on that, this is Stafford Beer, a quite accomplished cyberneticist. He wrote an essay in the early 80s called "They Said You Are Gods." Similar to Mary Douglas, he was interested in how our experience of reality is dependent upon our models of reality. And there you can see he's saying we cannot regulate our interaction with any aspect of reality that our model of reality does not include, because we can't, by definition, be conscious of it. I don't necessarily agree with that part. I think we can be conscious of things that our model of reality doesn't include, but we can't really know it, if that makes sense. The regulation that the regulator can achieve is only as good as the model of reality that it contains. So again, I think that's a widely applicable concept. It certainly maps onto the UFO controversy as a scientific controversy, because we don't yet have a model of reality that can include UFOs, at least in the conventional sense of physics and astronomy and cosmology and so on. So again, just drawing attention to that fact that what we're actually kind of experiencing for the most part as humans is a version of reality that's largely shaped by our models. And if we believe Douglas, every now and again something will intrude or penetrate into that reality that doesn't fit within your model. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to ignore it? Are you going to pretend that it didn't exist? That's a lot of people's first response. Are you going to push it down into the back of your mind, compartmentalize it because it doesn't fit? Some people manage to do that. Other people don't manage to do that, and it becomes something that requires them to literally kind of rework and expand their model to include something paranormal. And that word paranormal, by the way, para just means beside. So paranormal doesn't mean magical or even miraculous. It just means something besides the normal. Okay, so I hope we can agree at least that paranormal phenomena absolutely exist, because as Douglas reminds us, anything that we would consider paranormal just hasn't been included in our system of classification yet. Our system is what creates the normal as a concept. That's a construction, the idea of the normal. Sorry for the wall of text. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly here so we can get further into it. The bold part at the end is what I would want to take from William Rees, one of my favourite ecologists, writes a lot about ecological overshoot, our overconsumption of the planet's resources, and why we seem unable to do anything about the crisis that most of us can accept we're in. He points out that humans evolved to be very good at dealing with immediate short-term problems. We have not evolved to deal with long emergencies. So if you think back to COVID and how it was managed in many countries around the world, generally we did much better dealing with the sudden COVID emergencies than we've done with the long problem of COVID. In fact, we even call the ongoing syndrome long COVID. And that public health problem of long COVID is absolutely not being managed very well at all. Now, there are political reasons for that as well, economic and so on, but there's also an evolutionary reason. Humans just are not very good at long problems. But the point that Rees is making here is sociologists, building on Stafford Beer's point, refer to the social construction of reality, although more accurately we could refer to it as the social construction of shared perception. So all I wanted to sort of get at there was the model of reality that we inhabit that allows us to experience an orderly world, a meaningful world, is not our own personal creation, it's a social construction. And different cultures and different societies in different periods of history inhabit the same physical world, but they don't experience it in the same way because their social construction of the shared perceptions is different. And it should, I think, be obvious that in a media-saturated society like ours, our shared perceptions of the world are increasingly shaped by media. Humans haven't always had screens. I know that's an obvious point, but it's easy to forget. In fact, most of human history was screenless. Sometimes I romanticize that period and wish I could experience it. The point here, though, is shared perceptions are socially constructed. And here's the godfather of ufology, Jacques Vallée, asking in his classic book, The Invisible College, could it be that our reaction to the reports, individually and collectively, is as much a part of the UFO phenomenon as the objects themselves? It's kind of a rhetorical question that Vallée is posing there. He thinks the answer is yes to that question. I absolutely think the answer is yes to that question. It relates to what I suggested earlier. Humans are not entirely in control of their own society. The reports that we make about UFOs are part of the phenomenon, I would say. I absolutely agree with Jacques Vallée on that one. Okay, now I'm keeping an eye on the time here, and it's passing a lot quicker than what I thought. 3 points here that I've illustrated to sort of show how they intersect. So I've already kind of covered this. I just want to sum up here. We're obliged to think not only about what UFOs are, but to think with UFOs to learn what they mean. I'd also say related to that, UFOs are not only physical anomalies, they are communicative events. This is something that Jeffrey Kripal writes about a lot as well, that meaning is at the core of these events in a way. So yeah, we can get sort of, if you're in that mode of like, if we need the physicists to explain to us what these objects are, if they've been captured as part of this secret retrieval program, then they can be turned over to the scientists and then we'll know what UFOs are. I'm skeptical that that will ever happen, and I'm also skeptical that that is the best approach to take, actually. I think at least an equally legitimate approach is to think about what the phenomenon means. And as I mentioned earlier, non-human intelligence is already involved in the social construction of our shared perceptions of reality. It's certainly the case with AI algorithms. It's certainly the case with non-human animals, and my thinking is that it's also the case with the intelligence or intelligences that are behind many UFO phenomena. So 3 interlocking concepts, I think they kind of cooperate together. When you think about one, it starts turning the cog of the other one and so on. Now, I've already sort of mentioned this at the beginning, so I'm going to sort of jump past this here, but just to refresh, non-human intelligence is real. The only debate is like, how big is the category? We've got the animals, we've got the AI neural networks, which we know are real, but we don't understand really how they work. And then we've got UFOs, I would add as that third category. Unknown, relatively not understood. Now, I want to get to close encounters of the third kind, because that's my main sort of example. And I'm aware that I'm over an hour now. I want to sort of try and wrap up at about 10 past, quarter past. I should have probably rehearsed this before. attempting it, so that we've got that time for questions. So forgive me if I sort of race through this. If anyone wants these slides, by the way, afterwards, you can just email me and I'll happily share them with you. So thinking with UFOs and learning what they mean, I think, involves communication. What is communication? Use the etymology of the word. So like a lot of English, it has Latin roots, communis, meaning common, public, general. And then you can see its various iterations before we have the word communication, early 15th century, as the verb. So I think UFOs are a form of communication. They are making themselves common, public, general, and so on. I mean, just think about the extent to which UFO phenomena have become part of popular culture globally over the last 80 years or so. That doesn't happen if you're trying to not be seen. In my estimation, it wouldn't really make sense. And again, as I mentioned, I rewatched the film Communion. I know it differs from the book in some ways. It's a book about communication, in my view. Strieber isn't talking about an alien invasion. He's not talking about a government conspiracy to keep technology secret and reverse engineer it, and so on. He's talking about communion between human beings and non-human intelligence. And I don't think he even uses the word aliens in Communion. It's been a while since I read it. I think he prefers, others, and he draws direct relationships between the beings that he encounters and fairies, and wonders, is it the same intelligence but taking a different form? Is the intelligence presenting itself in ways that it thinks will be most meaningful to the culture in which it appears and the time period that it's appearing in? I think there might be something to that. And even if you just think about the different forms that UFOs have taken over the last 80 years, you don't see a lot of those classic post-war flying saucers anymore. And the reason for that might be the objects themselves are manifesting in ways that the intelligence believes are meaningful or likely to be most meaningful to the people that are being shown. And then media, just very briefly, because I'm a media studies scholar, I have to define my terms. Think of media as anything between a communicator and a receiver through which meaning is transmitted. So all communication really relies on some form of media. I'm communicating with all of you now through media. There's stuff between me and you that's facilitating the message. Even if we were in face-to-face conversation, the air would be the medium through which the communication is occurring. And what I'm thinking, and again, I'm still forming these thoughts because this is kind of new work for me. I'm thinking that UFOs can be thought with as forms of media, that they might be a form of media themselves. As I mentioned, their form and their shape and the behavior might be the message. Rather than waiting for them to broadcast a radio signal or pop up some speakers and start talking to us, maybe their behavior and their appearance is intended to be meaningful to us in our particular society and particular historical period. Okay, now I'm assuming most, if not all of you, have seen this film. It is an absolute classic, and I just want to finish off by talking about why I think this is such a significant piece of UFO media and how it's really helped me develop the thoughts that I've tried to share with you over the last hour or so. If you haven't seen this, if you've seen it, but if you haven't seen it, please do watch it at your earliest opportunity. If you have seen it but haven't watched it in like 5 years or longer, I'd suggest re-watching it because I think it will surprise you, not just in terms of visually how well it holds up. It's got this strangely ageless quality to it. It just looks better than even a lot of films that are made today. But the way it portrays UFO phenomena is so sophisticated. It's what I'm going to talk about in a moment, that I can't imagine a better UFO feature film ever been produced. Maybe someone will do it. I'd be surprised if that happens. So my thinking about this film is, first of all, yes, of course, it's a Hollywood blockbuster film, but it's more than that. So I think it's doing the film a disservice to define it merely as a piece of entertainment. It is absolutely entertaining. It's masterful entertainment, something Steven Spielberg is very capable of producing, but it is more than that. And it's the more than that I want to try and talk about here. So in my mind, Close Encounters is not merely a film about communication with non-human intelligence. The film itself is part of our co-constitutive communication with non-human intelligence. Okay, I think that part of what the intelligence is trying to tell us comes to us through this film. Okay, it might sound a little bit kooky, and I'd be very nervous even suggesting that to my media studies colleagues, but I'm going to try and explain why I've started thinking that way about this particular film, but UFO media in general. This is just one example of a bigger phenomenon, I think, that's occurring with UFO media. Interesting quote from an interview with Spielberg when the film was released, shortly after the film was released. Spielberg was a really big UFO buff in the 70s. I'm sure he's still interested in it, but he was really into it, particularly back then. A lot of Hollywood filmmakers seek cooperation from the US military and the government, and particularly NASA, when they're making big blockbusters that have the military in them, because you want to borrow some of the tech and the hardware. So if you know, the military is part of the story of Close Encounters. Spielberg wanted their cooperation so that he could borrow some of the jeeps and the choppers and the planes and so on. The thing is, if you want the military to lend you stuff, or even to let you have footage of their aircraft carriers and so on, you have to show them the scripts, and they have to approve the scripts. And it's very common, actually, for big blockbusters like the Michael Bay films, Transformers, Top Gun is another example. The script will often come back from the military going, yeah, we might lend you the stuff, but you need to change this, change that, take that out, and so on. And that's why you might have noticed that we don't really have any big blockbuster Hollywood films that have lots of military gear in them that paint the military in a negative light. You know, they end up being quite propagandistic, actually, because the army will only cooperate if it makes them look good. The long story short version here is Spielberg didn't get the cooperation from NASA that he wanted. He didn't get the cooperation from the army. So there are army uniforms in the film, but Spielberg had to source those himself and make them in wardrobe. He wasn't lent any of that stuff. And he says here, he wanted cooperation, but when they read the script, they got very angry and felt that it was a film that would be dangerous. I think mainly, so Close Encounters was the film he made after Jaws, as you know, a huge hit, probably the first kind of summer blockbuster film. He's sort of being a little bit facetious there, because Jaws convinced so many people around the world that there were sharks in toilets and bathtubs, not just in the oceans and rivers. They were afraid the same kind of epidemic would happen with UFOs. Now, I don't think people really believe there are sharks in bathtubs. The point he's getting at there is people's general fear of sharks spiked after Jaws. So the film Jaws shaped people's perceptions of reality. And that's why NASA, according to Spielberg here, was very uncooperative and didn't really approve the script, because they thought, well, this movie is going to make people believe in UFOs, which of course was a big part of Spielberg's intention with the film. It quite explicitly attempts to convince us that this stuff is really going on. Another quote, if folks aren't familiar with this book, it's a really good one by Robbie Graham, all about Hollywood UFO movies. And a lot of it is about the cooperation or lack thereof with the military and the government to shape public perceptions of UFO phenomena through Hollywood films. As I mentioned, the Air Force and also the National Guard Bureau didn't support the production of close encounters either. That's a quote from Major Sidney Shaw explaining why. You can see there in bold, the proposed film leaves a distinct impression that UFOs in fact do exist. And the Army didn't want the public to believe that UFOs exist. And it certainly didn't want the public to believe that there was a big government and military conspiracy to cover up the existence of UFOs, which, if you've seen Close Encounters, you know that's a big theme in the film as well. The climax at the end, where the big ship arrives, the government has set up this exchange, this rendezvous, and they've created a fake story about a chemical spill to try and keep the public out of the area, and they're covering it up. So it feeds into that idea that the government knows more than what they're telling us, and the military didn't want people thinking in that way. Now, what Robbie Graham says about how UFOs operate in media, I think is really interesting. He talks about this idea, it's kind of from postmodernist philosophy, the hyperreal. So cinematic simulations of ufological history simultaneously actualize and fictionalize their underlying subject matter. So this is another version of what I mentioned at the beginning as X-filing. It's kind of both. It's not either or, it's both and. And this is kind of like the UFO problem in a nutshell. It's kind of like fictional but actual at the same time. And the human brain can sort of get a bit fuzzy, short-circuiting, trying to hold both of those categories together simultaneously. So the word for that is hyperreal, both real and unreal simultaneously. UFOs aren't the only example of hyperreality, but I think they're the best example. There's something about the phenomena of UFOs that really lend themselves to hyperreality. It's why I'm skeptical of there ever being a real photograph of the UFO or a real video, because I don't think that word used in that context helps us get at the nature of the phenomenon that it's trying to describe. I think hyperreal is probably a better term. I'm not going to take you through the 3 stages there. If you're interested in that, Robbie Graham's book explains it. The point is there's a real phenomenon occurring, it's then represented, and then it enters this hyperreal sense, and we lose the ability to kind of think in terms of real and unreal. And the image comes to mean more than the actual reality that it's trying to describe or prove. It's one of the reasons why people are kind of obsessed with photos of UFOs or videos or representations, I think. We've kind of given up on having direct, predictable engagement with the phenomenon at will. It doesn't cooperate with us. And so we're very reliant on media to form that relationship with the phenomena. And that's kind of how a lot of our relationships with insects have been formed as well. They're difficult to get at directly, but we've got lots of imagery which can sort of substitute for the phenomena. I just want to, so I can have a quick break from talking. This is like a 2-minute clip of, so Roy Neary, played by Richard Dreyfuss. This is the scene when he has this UFO encounter. And I just would like you to notice what's going on in this scene. I think it's an example of the UFO as a hyperreal communicative event in the film. Remember, I'm also claiming that the film itself is hyperreal and is a communicative event. But notice how many forms of media appear in this scene and the way in which the UFO's presence affects the media. I think that's part of the message of what's going on. Okay, so no, I think everything included in the frame is there for a reason. Spielberg, very conscious of what he's showing the audience. And you could see there right at the end that the UFO's presence activated that network of communication. The radio starts to light up, people are calling in the reports. I interpret that as being a deliberate, not an accidental effect of what the UFO is doing. The UFO is doing that on purpose, knowing that part of what it's going to achieve is a communicative phenomenon. of course, what happens after this encounter is, you might have noticed at the beginning of that encounter, Roy Neary gets flashed, and he sort of grimaces and pulls his head back in to the car. It seems to me that that's the moment that this image is psychically transplanted into his mind. So if you've seen the film, you know about this. It's kind of iconic. He's obsessed with this shape, but he doesn't know what it means, and he doesn't know why it's in his mind. And it becomes an obsession. He makes a mashed potato shape out of it. His wife and children end up leaving. He's stuck alone with this obsession. It manifests at this huge sculpture that he just keeps working and working away at. Again, he doesn't know what it means. And then the tipping point for Roy Neary is he happens to notice on TV a fake news story about this chemical spill that's a cover story for the UFO arrival event around Devil's Tower in Wyoming. That's the name of this structure. It's a real structure in Wyoming. And when he sees the image on the TV screen, and here we are presented with it next to the three-dimensional image, which we know has emanated from it's in his mind, it all kind of locks in together. And it's from this point on that he's convinced that he starts to understand that this is a genuinely meaningful experience. He finds out that this Devil's Tower is a real place and he has to go there. He still doesn't know why he has to go there. He just knows it has something to do with the experience that he had. And of course, spoiler alert, he gets to witness the arrival of the ship at the film's climax. And just to finish off here, the film is so full of examples of this hyper-real sort of quality. The last one, there's heaps, but I just want to share one more before I finish. Here we have the army man, the military man, saying to the French scientist, so this is Claude Lacombe, played by the film director Francois Truffaut. Lacombe is trying to impress upon the military that the Devil's Tower is significant. There's some sort of relation between that structure and the phenomenon, because all these people are flocking to Devil's Tower, claiming that they've seen it in their dreams or in their mind, or they've had visions of it. The army man with his army mind says it's a coincidence, it's not scientific. To which Lacombe replies, one of the great lines in the film, "Listen to me, Major Walsh, it is an event sociological." And what he's meaning by that is this is not just a physically anomalous event, the event is a sociological one. It's a sociological one that has meaning and symbolism at its core. And that's something that the army mind of Major Walsh is struggling to process or accept. And in the final twist of hyper reality in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and some of you may be aware of this already, Claude Lacombe's character, the French scientist, is based on Jacques Vallée, who Steven Spielberg was very familiar with when he was writing and making Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And so we've kind of circled back to where we began. This quote from the Invisible College, could it be that our reaction to the reports, individually and collectively, is as much a part of the phenomenon as the objects themselves, is essentially what Claude Lacombe says in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Okay, so I don't think it's helpful to interpret Close Encounters of the Third Kind as just a fictional feature film. It is doing more than that. It's trying to move ideas about the reality of the phenomenon into the public realm in the form of an entertaining Hollywood film. Okay, I could talk on and on about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but I think that's more than enough for one night. So I thank everyone for your attention and for your patience, and I'll thank you for thinking with me as well. And that's the end of the talk.
So thanks, Adam, so much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure. And I
Thanks for
found
inviting
the
me.
presentation very interesting. made a whole page of notes. I'm going to go away and ponder.
Oh, great. Thanks, Cheryl.